The scent of expensive cologne mingled with cigarette smoke and candle wax, weaving through the golden light of the restaurant until it wrapped around me like a net I could not escape. My heels ached, my fingers trembled from balancing too many plates, and the laughter of strangers rose like waves that threatened to drown me. It was another night in the city, another endless shift where I became invisible and yet painfully exposed. I told myself I was strong, that I could survive anything, but even strength begins to fray when the hours are long and the heart is tired. I thought the evening would pass as the others had, quiet endurance until the clock reached midnight, but destiny, cloaked in shadows, had already opened the door, and everything I thought I knew about my life was about to change. I felt him before I saw him. My ex-husband, David, his presence cutting through the room like a knife pressed against skin. I froze, the porcelain in my hand nearly shattering from the tremor that ran through me. Months of silence collapsed in an instant, replaced by the memory of bruises, betrayals, and a smile that promised destruction. My chest tightened, and the air seemed to thin until I could barely draw breath. I could not face him, not here, not like this, not while I stood in the uniform that reduced me to nothing but a servant at his table. Fear is a cruel thief. It steals your breath, your voice, and the little fragments of dignity you cling to. I searched for escape, but every door was blocked by fate. In that heartbeat of panic, my gaze caught on the bar. Men in tailored suits, dark hair and darker eyes, sat like carved stone. And then, without reason or plan, I moved. My hand reached out, desperate and trembling, until it closed around the warm, steady hand of a stranger. In that fragile moment, survival disguised itself as intimacy. His skin against mine was firm, commanding, alive with a quiet strength that whispered of storms and silence, of danger and shelter. The world tilted. His eyes found mine, dark, unyielding, but strangely healing. They held me as if I were not a frightened woman in a crowded room, but something rare, something worth protecting. His presence was gravity, and I felt myself falling into it before I even knew his name. He leaned closer, his voice low and steady, and with a single word he rewrote the scene, reshaping my fear into something I could almost endure. He called me by a name not my own, yet in that instant it felt like salvation. Relief flooded me, but with it came a tremor of something more dangerous. Gratitude can blur into longing, and longing can blind us to the truth. I had not reached for any man. I had reached for the wrong man, or perhaps the only man fate had written for me. His hand on mine was no coincidence. It was a chain, a tether, pulling me into a world I had never dared to imagine. I should have pulled away. I should have let go. But instead, I let my fingers remain where they did not belong. Every heartbeat became louder, every sound around us faded into nothing but the rhythm of his voice. I could feel the weight of the past pressing against me, and yet here was this stranger, shielding me, claiming me, turning my humiliation into something strangely intimate. For a moment, I forgot David. I forgot the shame of working under dim lights for tips that barely covered rent. All I could feel was the steady warmth of a man whose very presence shifted the air. The restaurant did not matter anymore. The chatter, the clinking of glasses, the judgmental stares, they all dissolved into the background of a story that was no longer ordinary. This man was not simply a stranger. He was a storm wrapped in silence, a secret dressed in elegance, a danger that felt like healing. and even as fear tried to pull me back, I leaned forward, into him, into the possibility that life might not be a series of battles fought alone. It was reckless. It was dangerous. But it was the first time in years that I felt something close to hope. If this story touches a quiet place in your heart, if it makes you feel the fragile beauty of second chances and the way love can arrive when least expected, I invite you to stay with me. Your presence, your thoughts in the comments, your quiet support are more precious than you know. Like the gentle touch of a hand when the world feels too heavy, every gesture of kindness helps keep stories like this alive. If you find warmth here, let it linger, let it grow. Subscribe, share, and carry it forward. The night did not end with that touch. It began there. Because once you step into the orbit of a man like Vincent Russo, you cannot return unchanged. The hand I grabbed out of desperation became the hand that would lead me into a labyrinth of danger, tenderness, and a love that would heal wounds I thought would never close. And as his fingers curled lightly against mine, I knew the next chapter of my life had already begun, whether I was ready or not. The music swelled in the background, but to me it was silence. All I could hear was my own heartbeat and the unspoken promise in his gaze. That single moment would stretch into nights of secrets, mornings of fragile peace, and 1,000 choices between safety and surrender. My journey had only taken its first step, but destiny had already chosen its path. And so I followed, unaware that the hand I clung to was not just protection from the past. It was the key to a future that would demand everything I had to give. And with that, the story flows onward, deeper into shadows and light, where fear collides with tenderness, and healing begins in the most unexpected embrace. The moment stretched like fragile glass between us, shimmering with danger and possibility. His eyes, dark as midnight seas, seemed to pierce through the smoke and laughter that filled the restaurant. In them, I caught a reflection of myself I hadn't seen in years. Not the weary woman balancing plates and debts, not the mother carrying fear like a second skin, but a soul still capable of being seen, still worthy of tenderness. His gaze steadied me in a way no whispered reassurance ever could. It was not the look of a stranger. It was the look of someone who had already decided to stand between me and the storm. The weight of his hand on mine anchored me, calming the tremors of panic that had risen when I first saw David. I could still feel my ex-husband's presence in the room, his laughter sharp as broken glass, but it no longer cut through me the way it always had. Instead, Vincent, though I did not yet know his name, shifted his body subtly, blocking David's line of sight, as if the simple act of turning his shoulders could shield me from every shadow. His touch on the small of my back was firm, yet strangely healing, protective without being possessive, and for the first time in so long I allowed myself to breathe. The hum of the restaurant blurred. I became aware of the warmth radiating from the man beside me, a warmth that seemed to seep into the cracks of my spirit where exhaustion and loneliness had made their home. I wanted to step back, to reclaim the safe distance I had trained myself to keep, but I couldn't. His presence was gravity. The more I tried to resist, the more it pulled me in. And yet, it was not suffocating. It was a steadying kind of gravity, like the earth beneath bare feet after wandering too long through shifting sands. I whispered the truth with trembling lips. My ex-husband is here. The confession left me lighter, as if naming the fear aloud took away part of its power. His response was silence, but a silence alive with decision. He turned toward me, his face composed, every line carved with an authority that needed no announcement. And then he spoke a name, not mine, but one he gifted me in the moment, wrapping me in the safety of a story we shared. That single word was not a lie, but a shield, and I accepted it without question. In the reflection of polished glass behind the bar, I could see David being led to his table, his arrogance filling every gesture. My heart should have broken beneath the weight of his nearness, but instead I felt the stranger's hand steady me. I leaned into him unconsciously, my shoulder brushing his arm, and I realized that for once I did not want to disappear. I wanted to be seen, not by David, not by the past, but by this man who carried danger like a cloak and yet offered comfort like a whisper of healing rain. The men seated near us exchanged quiet glances, their deference directed toward him, not me. It struck me then, this was not an ordinary man. Power moved around him the way tides bend to the pull of the moon. I should have been afraid. Perhaps I was. Yet woven into that fear was something else. Curiosity, gratitude, and a fragile seed of longing I dared not water with thought. As David rose and headed toward the restrooms, his path angled toward the bar. Panic surged, cold and sharp. But before the breath of dread could fully leave my lungs, the stranger lifted his hand in the smallest gesture, so subtle it might have been mistaken for nothing at all. One of the men at his side intercepted David, redirecting him with effortless precision. I sat frozen, watching the moment unfold, realizing I had stepped into a web where protection and danger were threads of the same fabric. I should have asked questions. I should have recoiled. Instead, I felt a strange calm settle over me, as if this man's will alone could keep chaos at bay. His attention returned to me, his eyes softening for a brief second, just enough to remind me that beneath the steel there was something human, something that recognized my fragility and refused to let it break. Hours blurred into shadows. I moved through the rest of my shift as if in a dream, but not the kind that leaves you trembling in fear. This was a gentler dream, one stitched together by fleeting glances across the room, by the promise of a presence that lingered even when I tried not to notice. He remained there, silent but watchful, until the clock whispered of midnight. And when I stepped out into the cold night, weary bones aching beneath the weight of the day, I found that he had kept his word. The black car idled, breath clouding in the frosty air. His men stood like sentinels, their eyes scanning shadows I had long tried to ignore. One of them offered to drive me home. In his hand, an envelope heavier than anything I had ever held, filled with more money than I earned in weeks. My pride screamed to refuse, but the thought of rent unpaid, of Emma's shoes worn thin, silenced my protest. I accepted not out of greed, but survival, each bill a reminder of the fragile line I walked between despair and hope. When I arrived home, my daughter sleeping peacefully, I looked out the window and saw the silhouette of my ex-husband's car parked across the street. Ice filled my veins, but before fear could root itself fully, one of the stranger's men stood guard, his presence unyielding. David was forced to retreat into the night, his anger no match for the quiet menace of men who served someone far greater. I pressed my forehead to the cool glass, the envelope clutched to my chest. and realized that my world had shifted. By reaching for the wrong hand, I had found the only one strong enough to hold mine. The lines of fate had been redrawn, not in ink, but in fire, and there was no turning back. I did not know his name then, but already it was etched into the rhythm of my heart. He had entered my life like a shadow, yet carried with him the light of healing I had forgotten existed. And though part of me trembled at the danger he represented, another part, silent, secret, stubborn, whispered that perhaps this was the beginning of something I had long stopped believing in. A second chance, fragile but real. The story did not end at that doorway. It unfolded further with each dawn, each message, each moment when fear was met with steady strength. The stranger, the protector, the danger cloaked in warmth was no longer just a fleeting presence. He was becoming a constant, and with every step I found myself walking deeper into the labyrinth of his world, a world I had once thought would swallow me whole, but instead whispered the promise of healing and the quiet possibility of love. The city at night has its own heartbeat, steady and relentless, pulsing through neon signs and the hush of footsteps echoing in narrow streets. I walked home that evening with Emma's small hand clasped in mine, yet my thoughts kept circling back to the man whose presence lingered like smoke long after the fire was gone. He had not just shielded me in a crowded room. He had altered the rhythm of my night, leaving me both unsettled and strangely soothed. It was as though the shadows that had haunted me for years finally paused, held back by a force I did not understand, but could feel deep within my bones. At home, as Emma drifted into the soft safety of dreams, I sat by the window, the envelope of money untouched on the table, my eyes fixed on the world outside. Street lamps flickered against cracked sidewalks, and the familiar hum of my weary neighborhood wrapped itself around me. Yet beneath the ordinary night, something extraordinary stirred. The stranger, his hand, his voice, his dark, steady gaze, had already written himself into my story, whether I wanted it or not. Fear and longing braided together, making it impossible to separate the danger from the comfort. I could still feel his touch at the small of my back, protective, firm, almost healing. Days turned into a fragile rhythm, but nothing was the same. At the restaurant, I felt eyes following me, not hostile but watchful, as if invisible sentinels had been stationed around me. My co-workers whispered about the night I lingered too long at the bar with a man whose name they dared not speak aloud. Marco, the manager who once barked at me with disdain, now hesitated when his gaze fell on me, his tone softening in ways I never imagined. The shift in their behavior unsettled me, but deep inside it planted something else too, relief. For the first time since David had torn my world apart, I no longer felt entirely defenseless. I told myself I would not call the number pressed into my palm that night, written on a card as heavy and simple as fate itself. Yet each evening, as Emma and I shared pancakes or soup in our tiny kitchen, my fingers brushed against the outline of that card tucked into my apron, as if it carried a heartbeat of its own. I resisted, not out of disinterest, but out of fear. To call meant stepping deeper into a world that was already beginning to close around me, one that promised safety and peril in equal measure. And then, one night, as the last bus pulled away without me and the cold wrapped its unforgiving arms around my body, a black car appeared at the curb. The door opened, and there he was. Not a memory, not a fleeting shadow in a restaurant, but flesh and bone. more commanding in the quiet street than he had been under dim lights and clinking glasses. His presence filled the space like fire fills a hearth, warming and consuming all at once. He did not ask if I needed a ride. He simply stood there, certain that I would accept. And I did, because refusing him felt like refusing the very air I needed to breathe. Inside the car, the leather seats smelled faintly of cedar and something darker, masculine, unshakably him. The city slid past in blurred lights, and silence stretched between us, not awkward but dense, like a secret shared without words. His gaze lingered on me, not invasive but deliberate, as though he was memorizing every detail, every bruise half hidden by makeup, every line carved into my face by sleepless nights. I felt exposed under that gaze, but not diminished. For once, my scars did not make me smaller. They made me real, and he seemed to see all of me without turning away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, threaded with quiet authority. He told me he would wait outside the restaurant each night until I finished work, that I should not walk alone anymore. It was not a suggestion, but a vow, one made with the kind of certainty that left no room for doubt. My instinct was to protest, to cling to the independence I had fought to keep, but exhaustion won. For years I had carried every burden alone, fought every battle without backup, stitched my wounds in silence. And here, for the first time, someone was offering to stand between me and the storm. Emma stirred in her sleep that night, her small hand seeking mine in the dark. I held her tightly, listening to her soft breaths, and whispered promises into the quiet, promises of safety, of hope, of healing that felt closer now than they ever had. And yet, beneath it all, I wondered what price would come with this protection. Nothing in life was ever free. But when I thought of Vincent, the name I had finally learned, I realized I was already entangled, already walking down a path that had no return. Our lives began to shift in subtle ways. Emma laughed more freely, her little world untouched by the shadows pressing against mine. She adored the kind woman who appeared one evening to keep her company while I was summoned to dinner. Maria, whose warm smile and gentle hands reminded me of family I had long lost. In the glow of Vincent's home, where every corner whispered of wealth and secrecy, I felt both out of place and strangely welcomed. He moved through the rooms with quiet dominance, yet when he looked at me, there was a softness that disarmed every defense I tried to raise. One night, over candlelight that turned the edges of his face into sculpture, he told me he admired my strength. He spoke of the way I had survived, of the courage it took to raise a child alone, of the resilience etched into every weary line of my face. His words washed over me like healing rain, breaking apart the echoes of David's cruelty that had clung to me for too long. Where David's voice had torn me down, Vincent's lifted me, layer by fragile layer, until I began to believe I was more than my broken pieces. I left that dinner with a bracelet hidden in my purse, a small silver key dangling from it, a promise for new beginnings. It was more than a gift. It was a vow, though unspoken, that our paths were meant to intertwine. I touched it often in the days that followed, each brush of metal against my skin, reminding me that I was no longer standing on the edge of despair alone. The more I let him in, the more the walls I had built began to crumble. I saw the man behind the shadows, the one who listened intently when I spoke of Emma's favorite cartoons, who remembered the exact shade of her laughter, who softened whenever she called his name with innocent wonder. He was a contradiction, dangerous and gentle, feared by many, but capable of a tenderness that felt like sunlight on a winter morning. And though part of me feared the storm that always lingered just beyond his world, another part yearned for the shelter he offered. Love, I realized, does not always arrive with music and roses. Sometimes it slips in quietly, disguised as protection, as healing, as a steady hand in the chaos. And once it finds you, it is impossible to ignore. Each night, as I tucked Emma into bed and listened to her soft breathing, I found myself whispering a truth I could not yet say aloud, that I was beginning to fall, not recklessly, but with the steady inevitability of a tide drawn to the shore. And so, as the days blurred into weeks, I understood that the story had only just begun. What had started with fear and desperation was blossoming into something else, something fragile, something fierce, something I dared to hope could be love. A love not free of shadows, but strong enough to guide me through them, carrying both the weight of danger and the promise of healing. And though I did not yet know where this path would lead, I was already walking it with open eyes, my hand no longer trembling but steady, entwined with his. Rain drummed softly against the window that evening, a steady rhythm that wrapped the city in silver haze. I sat curled on the worn couch, Emma asleep in the next room, her tiny breaths rising and falling like the gentlest lullaby. The silver bracelet on my wrist gleamed under the muted lamplight, the small key dangling as if it carried secrets I had not yet been brave enough to unlock. My fingers traced it unconsciously, and with each touch I felt a whisper of warmth, as though it carried not only Vincent's promise, but a quiet healing I hadn't known I needed. The days since he had stepped into my life had unfolded like pages in a book written by unseen hands. There was a rhythm to his presence, messages that arrived when silence grew too heavy, cars waiting at the curb when I finished work, the subtle shift in how the world looked at me because of the shadow he cast. What frightened me most was not his power, nor the danger I knew simmered beneath every smooth gesture, but how natural it had begun to feel. The city that once seemed indifferent now bent around me in invisible ways, as if I had been folded into a world both protective and perilous. I remembered the first time Emma met him in the garden room at his home. Her eyes had widened at the glowing flowers, her laughter tumbling like bells as she twirled beneath the soft lights. Vincent had stood nearby, watching her with a look that softened the hard edges of his face. There was reverence in his gaze, a quiet tenderness I had never expected from a man whose very name carried whispers of fear. It was in that moment I realized something dangerous. He was no longer a stranger to her, and through her eyes I began to see him differently. He asked nothing of me in return for his protection, yet each evening when I looked into his eyes across a table or felt the brush of his hand guiding me through a doorway, I sensed an unspoken desire, one not rooted in possession, but in something deeper. He wanted to know me, to see me beyond the fractures, to learn the parts of me that had not been broken by the past. And though I told myself I should resist, that stepping further into his world would only bind me to dangers I did not understand, the truth was simpler and far harder to admit. I wanted him to know me too. One night he invited me to his library, a sanctuary lined with books that smelled of leather and time. Firelight painted his profile in shades of amber and shadow as he poured a glass of wine I did not drink. He asked about my childhood, about the dreams I had once carried before life taught me to survive instead of hope. At first, my answers were guarded, but his patience unraveled me. He listened, not with the distraction of someone offering courtesy, but with the attentiveness of a man gathering every thread of who I was, weaving them into something whole. I told him of the nights I stayed awake counting the minutes until Emma's morning smile, of the silent prayers whispered into darkness when the weight of debt pressed so heavy I thought I might break. I admitted the fear that lingered every time I heard footsteps behind me on empty streets. And when my voice faltered, he did not fill the silence with promises or empty words. Instead, he reached across the space between us and let his hand cover mine. His touch was steady, grounding, a warmth that bled into my skin and through it into places of my heart I had locked away. He spoke then, his voice low, roughened not by anger, but by memories. He told me of his own past, the family he had lost, the burdens he carried, the choices that had carved him into the man he was now. There were things he did not name, shadows he did not fully reveal, but the vulnerability in his eyes was enough. For a brief moment, the man who stood, feared by many, seemed as human as I was, flawed, weary, and longing for something gentler than the world had ever given him. It was in that quiet exchange, in the firelight and the silence, that I felt something shift irrevocably between us. The distance we had both guarded so carefully began to crumble, not with grand gestures, but with the slow, healing weight of truth. He leaned closer, his hand brushing mine, and though he did not kiss me then, I knew it was only a matter of time. The promise was already alive between us, a spark growing into flame. Yet even as warmth blossomed, shadows still reached for us. One night, as Emma slept in her small bed, I saw David's car parked across the street again. Fear clamped cold around my heart. But before I could move, a figure emerged from the shadows. Enzo, steady as stone, his presence enough to send David retreating into the night. Watching from behind the curtain, I realized the truth I had tried to deny. I was already under Vincent's protection, already bound to him in ways deeper than promises or gifts. The next day, Vincent's message arrived, his words firm yet tender. You and Emma are safe. As long as I breathe, no harm will touch you. I read those words again and again, each time feeling the walls inside me give way. To be safe, to be seen, to be cherished. It was more than I had dared to want, and yet it was being offered freely, wrapped not in illusion, but in quiet certainty. As weeks blurred into months, our lives intertwined further. He attended Emma's small milestones, listened to her chatter about stories and drawings as if every word were a treasure. And for me, he offered not only protection, but space to rediscover laughter, to remember the taste of dreams, to breathe without fear. The shadows of his world remained, but they no longer frightened me the way they once had. For within those shadows I found a light that felt steady, healing, unshakable. And so, on a night when the stars hung heavy above the sea, when firelight painted the room in warmth and silence, Vincent finally pressed a small velvet box into my hand. Inside lay not a diamond, but a sapphire, deep blue like the ocean at midnight, set in a ring that glowed with meaning. His words were simple, yet boundless. This is my promise. I will leave behind the life that binds me, and I will build another, with you, with Emma, if you'll allow me. Tears blurred my vision as I looked into his eyes, seeing not just power or danger, but the raw vulnerability of a man offering his soul. And though fear whispered of risks, of battles not yet fought, I found my voice steady. I told him yes. Not an easy yes, not one blind to the storm around us, but a yes carved from hope, from love, from the belief that even in the darkest places, healing could grow. The night did not end with a kiss of farewell, but with the quiet sealing of a vow. His lips brushed my hand, his eyes lingering on mine with a softness that unraveled every wall I had built. And as I left with Emma asleep in my arms, the sapphire catching the light of the stars, I knew we had crossed a threshold. What began in fear had become something else entirely. A love both fragile and fierce, born in shadows, yet carrying the power to heal everything the past had broken. The story flowed onward, not into certainty, but into the wild unknown, where every step carried both risk and promise. And though the road ahead was dangerous, my heart carried no doubt. For the first time in years, I was no longer walking alone. The ocean stretched before us like a sheet of liquid glass, restless yet strangely calming, its rhythm echoing the pulse that trembled beneath my skin. Vincent's hand lingered in mine, the sapphire on my finger catching the last fragments of sunlight before night claimed the horizon. The beach house smelled faintly of cedar and salt, and every corner of it whispered of solitude, a place far removed from the noise of the city, from shadows that trailed too closely behind us. He had brought me here not to impress, but to reveal, to strip away the armor that clung to him in every other space. Inside, firelight painted the walls in gold, and the soft crackle of burning wood wrapped the silence in warmth. Vincent stood before the window, his gaze fixed on the restless sea. He looked less like the man whose name commanded fear, and more like someone carrying the weight of too many lifetimes. His shoulders, broad and strong, seemed heavier in that moment, as though even power could not protect him from what lay inside his heart. When he turned to me, I saw not the calculated steadiness of a man used to control, but something raw, unguarded, human. "I have begun to unravel the world I built," he confessed, though no question had been asked. "Piece by piece, I'm walking away from it." His voice was low, steady, but I caught the fracture within it, the risk of vulnerability, the weight of dangerous choices already set into motion. I listened, my own heart tight with the knowledge that his decisions were no longer just his. Every step he took into the unknown now bound Emma and me with him. Yet even with fear tightening its hold, I felt something deeper rising within me. Trust. Fragile, reckless, healing trust. He moved closer, his fingers brushing mine, and I felt the truth of his words not only in the sound, but in the warmth of his touch. It was not power he offered me, it was choice. And choice, after so many years of being trapped, was its own kind of miracle. The firelight caught the edges of his face, the fine lines carved by time and scars of battles unseen, and I realized he had given me more than promises. He had given me his truth. The ring he placed upon my hand was not an engagement, not yet, but it was a vow carved in sapphire, heavy with meaning. "A promise," he said softly, his thumb brushing across my knuckles as though grounding the weight of the moment into my skin. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with the kind of emotion that spills over when the soul recognizes a turning point. I whispered yes, my voice trembling yet firm, and in that single word I gave him something I had not given anyone in years: faith. When he kissed me that night, it was not the claiming kiss of a man accustomed to command. It was tender, reverent, a slow unfolding of desire woven with restraint, as though he knew how fragile I still was and chose to cradle me instead of consume me. My body leaned into his without thought, my heart finding rhythm in the steady beat of his chest. For a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. There was no danger, no past, no shadows. There was only warmth, only the healing sweetness of being held by someone who saw me whole. Yet love does not silence the world. It only gives you strength to face it. Days later, David appeared again, uninvited, venom dripping from every word he hurled into the small space I had tried to call home. His hands, once too familiar, reached for me with the violence of old, but this time I did not cower. I remembered Vincent's eyes, the way he told me I was stronger than I believed, and in that moment I found my voice. "Not any more," I said, my words steady, cutting through David's rage like steel. When Enzo stepped through the door, his presence filling the room with unshakable calm, I did not feel fear. I felt relief, a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, finally released. David stumbled backward, his bluster collapsing beneath the quiet certainty of a man who needed no threats to be dangerous. For the first time, I saw my ex-husband shrink, not because of his weakness, but because I no longer gave him the power to define me. And though the confrontation left me trembling, it also left me freer than I had ever been. Later that night, as Vincent gathered me into his arms, fury still burning in the depths of his gaze, I realized he was no longer just protecting me from David. He was fighting for a future where fear would no longer have a place in my life. "We leave tonight," he told me, his voice calm yet absolute. I wanted to protest, to cling to the small familiarity of my apartment, the life I had pieced together from scraps, but his certainty was contagious. I packed not with despair, but with a sense of liberation, each item I placed in the suitcase a step away from the chains of my past. Emma stirred as I dressed her in warm clothes, her sleepy eyes lifting to mine with innocent trust. "Are we going on an adventure, Mummy?" she asked, her voice soft and drowsy. My heart swelled as I brushed a curl from her cheek. "Yes, baby," I whispered. "The biggest adventure yet." She nestled into my arms, unafraid, and in her calm I found my own. The healing of a child's trust is sometimes the strongest balm of all. When Vincent led us into the night, the car waiting with its quiet purr, I did not look back at the cracked walls or the window where I had spent countless nights staring out at a world that seemed to have no place for me. Instead, I looked forward, to the hand that closed around mine, to the sapphire glinting with promise, to the future that was uncertain yet alive with possibility. The road stretched into darkness, but for the first time in years the darkness did not frighten me. It felt like a canvas waiting for new colors, for new beginnings. Vincent sat beside me, his presence steady, Emma's small body nestled against me in sleep, and I realized that hope had returned, not in a sudden blaze, but in a steady glow, warm and healing, enough to light the way ahead. And as the city lights faded behind us, swallowed by night and distance, I understood that the life I once thought lost was only beginning. Not because I had escaped, but because I had finally chosen to walk toward something more, toward love, toward safety, toward a promise that felt as unshakable as the hand I held. The past might still reach for me, but the future was already unfolding, and this time I would not walk it alone. The safe house was nothing like I expected. Hidden beyond winding roads and quiet fields, it stood wrapped in ivy and moonlight, a place where silence did not threaten but soothed. Its walls carried the scent of wood and lavender, the kind of fragrance that feels like a hand brushing gently across weary skin. Emma's laughter echoed as she explored the unfamiliar rooms, her small feet pattering against polished floors, her voice filling corners that had long been still. Watching her dance through the light spilling from chandeliers felt like watching a wound close, slow, steady, healing. Vincent walked beside me, his hand never far from mine. There was no grand announcement of what this house meant, no declaration of power or wealth. Instead, he showed me the kitchen stocked with food I had once struggled to afford, the bedrooms warm with quilts folded neatly across beds, the small garden alive even in the chill of autumn. It was not opulence he offered, it was safety, a sanctuary built not of stone alone, but of intent. For the first time in years, I let my body exhale completely, my shoulders easing under the quiet weight of security. At night, when Emma drifted into sleep clutching her rabbit beneath a blanket soft as clouds, Vincent and I sat by the fire. The flames painted his profile in copper and shadow, the flicker catching in his dark eyes. He told me pieces of his story, fragments shaped not by the man the world whispered about, but by the boy who had once dreamed of simpler things. His words came slowly, as though each one carried weight he had never entrusted to another. I listened, my heart opening in ways I hadn't realized it still could. And when silence finally settled between us, it was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of understanding. The days unfolded gently. Emma learned the names of the flowers in the garden from Maria, who visited often, her presence carrying the warmth of family. I cooked meals in a kitchen that felt too grand for me, yet Vincent insisted on tasting everything, praising dishes as though they were treasures. His compliments were not empty. They were deliberate, softening the roughness life had etched into me, reminding me that even the smallest acts had worth. Slowly, the scars left by years of belittlement began to fade, covered not by denial, but by the healing balm of being cherished. Yet shadows lingered at the edges of our peace. At night, I sometimes glimpsed figures moving along the tree line, guards, always watching, silent protectors stationed by Vincent. Their presence reminded me that we were not free yet, that danger waited just beyond the horizon. But instead of fear, I felt something new, resolve. Love, when it takes root, gives courage to places once hollow. The thought of protecting Emma, of protecting the fragile hope blooming between Vincent and me, gave me a strength I had never carried alone. One evening, as twilight spread its violet veil across the sky, Vincent placed a phone in my hand, sleek and small. "For safety," he said simply. "A secure line. Only I can reach you through it." The gesture was both unsettling and comforting. It was a reminder of the danger that still followed us, but also of his determination that no shadow would touch me without his knowing. I carried that phone close, not as a chain but as a lifeline, its weight reassuring in my pocket. Emma adored him. She climbed into his lap as though she had always belonged there, her small hands tugging at his sleeve as she showed him drawings of gardens filled with stars and castles that glowed in the dark. He listened with patience, his large hands carefully holding the fragile pages, his smile softening into something almost unrecognizable from the man feared in whispers. Watching them together stirred something in me so powerful it frightened me. Not fear of him, but fear of how deeply he had already entwined himself into the core of our lives. One night, after Emma had fallen asleep beside the fire with her head resting against his shoulder, Vincent carried her to bed with a gentleness that made my throat tighten. When he returned, the quiet between us stretched, charged with something unspoken. He reached for my hand, his thumb tracing the inside of my wrist where my pulse fluttered like a secret. His voice dropped to a whisper. "You've given me something no one else ever has. Peace." Tears filled my eyes because it was the truth mirrored back at me. I had thought he was my protector, the shield between me and the storm. But in that moment, I realized I was something to him as well, a reminder of humanity, of tenderness, of the healing power found in love, freely given. His confession was not grand, not dressed in poetry, but it was enough to shift the earth beneath my feet. The kiss that followed was deeper than the first, no longer tentative, but full of the longing we had both held back. His lips were warm, steady, reverent, yet carrying the promise of storms yet to come. I let myself surrender to it, not because I had forgotten the dangers, but because love had begun to outweigh fear. But in his arms, I did not feel like a woman running from her past. I felt like a woman finally stepping into her future. But futures are never free of shadows. The following days brought whispers of unrest, of men who did not approve of Vincent's decision to leave behind the empire he had built. He shielded me from details, but I saw the tightness in his jaw, the flicker of tension in his eyes when he thought I wasn't looking. I wanted to ask, to demand clarity, but instead I chose to trust him. Trust was the bridge we were building, plank by plank, and though it swayed under the weight of uncertainty, I refused to let it break. Emma's laughter filled the halls, Maria's songs drifted through the kitchen, the garden bloomed even in the cooling air, and amid it all, Vincent and I carved moments of tenderness. A touch at the small of my back, his hand lingering at the curve of my waist, his gaze meeting mine across a crowded room of his men. Each gesture stitched itself into the fabric of my being, creating a tapestry of love stronger than any fear. And one night, as the wind howled outside and the fire burned low, he whispered against my hair, 2 months more. Then it's done. Then we'll be free. His words sank into me, both promise and warning. I clung to them, to him, to the hope that healing could be permanent, that love could outlast even the darkest storms. The night stretched long, but I did not fear it. For the first time in years, I lay down not with dread, but with peace. Emma safe in the next room, Vincent's hand warm against mine, and the quiet certainty that whatever waited ahead, we would face it together. The shadows might rise again, but love had already planted its roots too deep to be torn away. And so the story carried us forward, not into certainty, but into a dawn waiting just beyond the horizon, where healing would meet courage, and love would demand everything we had left to give. The days that followed unfolded in a rhythm both fragile and profound, as if time itself had slowed to allow us space to breathe, to mend, to begin anew. In the safe house, mornings were no longer heavy with dread, but softened by the sound of Emma's laughter, echoing through the halls. She woke each day with light in her eyes, chasing sunbeams across the polished floors, her curls bouncing as she ran through the garden where autumn leaves fell like golden rain. I watched her play, and every smile she offered felt like a thread stitching my soul back together, a gentle healing that words could never fully capture. Vincent often joined her, kneeling in the grass in a suit far too fine for such moments, allowing Emma to crown him with leaves or pull his hand toward the fountain where she pretended fish swam beneath the water. The sight of him, this man whose name carried the weight of shadows, laughing softly at the whim of a child, disarmed me in ways I had not thought possible. In his presence, the world seemed less sharp, the scars of the past less consuming. It was as though love, even in its tentative bloom, had begun to smooth the jagged edges of our lives. At night, after Emma's eyes fluttered closed and her breath settled into the soft cadence of dreams, Vincent and I would linger near the fire. He rarely spoke of business, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed the battles waged beyond the sanctuary of these walls. Instead, he asked about me, what books had shaped my childhood, what dreams I had tucked away in the corners of survival, what colors I imagined when I thought of happiness. I told him truths I had never said aloud, fragile confessions of longing and loss, and he listened as though every word carried the weight of a promise. His listening was healing in itself, a balm against years of being dismissed, silenced, ignored. There were moments when silence stretched between us, not empty, but alive, filled with unspoken things that trembled just beneath the surface. His hand would reach for mine, steady, grounding, and I would let myself lean into that touch. The warmth of his palm against my skin spoke more than any vow could. It told me I was safe. It told me I was seen. And in that simple connection, I found a peace I had not known since long before my life had been fractured. One evening, beneath a sky woven with stars, he led me to the balcony that overlooked the fields. The air was crisp, the kind that carries both the bite of winter and the promise of spring. He stood behind me, his arms encircling my waist, his breath brushing against my hair. "When this is finished," he whispered, his voice low and steady, "I want to take you and Emma somewhere the shadows cannot follow. Somewhere the air tastes of salt and sunlight, where she can run freely and you can breathe without fear." His words painted visions of Italy, of vineyards stretching toward the horizon, of quiet mornings where the only sound was the laughter of a child and the beating of hearts at peace. I closed my eyes, letting the image take root inside me. For the first time, I dared to imagine a future not defined by fear or survival, but by love. The thought was terrifying, its beauty almost unbearable, because I had learned too well how quickly dreams could shatter. Yet standing there in his arms, beneath a canopy of stars, I found myself believing. Hope, once buried beneath the rubble of pain, stirred alive, fragile yet insistent. But shadows do not fade easily. News arrived, carried in the hushed tones of Vincent's men, of unrest within the circles he was leaving behind. Those who thrived on his power did not wish to see it relinquished, and whispers of betrayal lingered in the air. I saw the weight of it in his eyes, the way he lingered longer at the window, scanning horizons not for beauty, but for threat. Still, he did not falter in his tenderness with me, nor in his devotion to Emma. He shielded us from details, but I could feel the storm circling, its winds pressing harder against the fragile walls of our sanctuary. And then came the night when the storm breached. It began with silence. The kind of silence that feels wrong, too still, too heavy. Emma was asleep, her stuffed rabbit tucked beneath her chin, when the crack of tires against gravel cut through the calm. I moved to the window, heart pounding, and saw headlights slicing through the darkness. Before fear could consume me, Vincent's hand was at my back, guiding me away from the glass, his voice steady but firm. "Stay with her. Do not open the door for anyone but me." His certainty steadied me, even as dread curled cold and sharp inside my chest. Minutes stretched like hours. Voices outside, muffled but tense, clashed against the quiet of the night. I clutched Emma closer, whispering soft promises into her dreams, promises of safety, of love, of healing that I prayed would never be broken. When the door finally opened and Vincent stepped inside, his presence filled the room with calm. His jaw was tight, his eyes darker than I had ever seen, but he crossed to us with hands steady, placing one over mine as if to ground me. "It's over," he said softly, and though I knew it was not truly over, I let his words be the balm that carried me through. Later, when Emma slept once more, he told me the truth. There had been an attempt to dissuade him, men sent not only to challenge but to threaten what he held dear. He spoke with restraint, his words measured, but I could hear the weight of what had almost been lost. Yet even in that confession, he looked at me not with fear, but with determination. "They will not take this from us," he said, his voice low but fierce. "Not you, not her, not what we are building." His vow was not just protection. It was defiance, a declaration that love itself was worth every risk. I reached for him then, my fingers brushing against his cheek, feeling the tension there, the storm held at bay. "You don't have to carry it all alone," I whispered, my voice trembling with both fear and love. His eyes softened, the darkness in them yielding to something gentler, and he leaned into my touch as though it were the only anchor he had left. In that moment, the power he carried meant nothing. He was simply a man, weary and wounded, craving the healing touch of love. The kiss that followed was not born of passion alone, but of desperation, of a need to remind each other that even in the heart of chaos, we were alive, together, unbroken. His lips were warm, steady, lingering with a promise that went deeper than words. I melted into him, not because he was strong, but because he allowed me to be strong beside him. We were no longer protector and protected. We were two souls fighting toward the same dawn. And as the night faded into the soft blush of morning, I knew the path ahead would not be easy. Betrayal lurked, danger pressed closer, and the storm had not yet spent its rage. But love had already rooted itself too deep to be torn away. Healing had begun to spread through the cracks of our broken pasts, binding us together with something stronger than fear. The future still trembled with uncertainty, but as Vincent's hand closed around mine and Emma stirred with sleepy smiles in the next room, I felt a truth stronger than any shadow. Whatever storms lay ahead, we would walk through them not as fractured souls, but as a family finding its way toward the light. And that belief fragile and fierce, carried us forward into the next chapter, where love would be tested, and healing would prove itself not a fleeting balm, but a force powerful enough to endure. The morning we left the safe house was wrapped in mist, the kind of mist that makes the world feel softer, gentler, as though it wants to hide its scars. Emma clung to her rabbit, her small face pressed against my shoulder, her curls damp with dew. Vincent walked beside us, steady as ever, his hand brushing mine when the path narrowed, his presence a silent vow. Behind us, the ivy-covered sanctuary faded into distance, carrying with it the echoes of nights by the fire, confessions whispered in shadows, and the fragile, healing peace we had found there. Ahead of us stretched the unknown, dangerous and unpromised, yet alive with hope. The car carried us through winding roads and into the city's heartbeat once more. It no longer felt like the same city. Before, it had been a place of fear, where every corner held the memory of David's cruelty, where every shadow seemed to whisper defeat. Now it felt different, because Vincent was beside me. I watched him from the corner of my eye, his profile carved in silence, his eyes scanning the horizon with quiet vigilance. To others, he was still a man whose name inspired caution, but to me, he had become something entirely different. A harbor, a place where I could rest without fear of being broken again. We stayed in another house, quieter but still guarded, the kind of place where windows opened to gardens, and every doorway hummed with the weight of watchful eyes. I learned then that protection was not a cage, but a gift, a way of saying your life matters, your peace matters. For too long I had been taught that my safety was mine alone to carry, and now sharing that weight felt like a healing I hadn't known I needed. Nights bled into days, with a rhythm that felt both tender and tense. Emma filled the house with her laughter, her crayons scattered across the table, her songs drifting through the halls like sunlight made into sound. Maria visited often, her presence gentle, weaving a sense of family around us like a warm shawl. And Vincent, he was everywhere and nowhere at once. Sometimes I found him by the fire, his eyes distant, his jaw tight with the weight of choices he had not yet spoken aloud. Other times he appeared at Emma's side, kneeling to listen to her chatter as though she were the only voice that mattered in the world. One evening, beneath the pale glow of the moon, he drew me into his arms in the garden. The air was cool, fragrant with jasmine, and the world beyond the walls seemed to pause in reverence. His forehead rested against mine, his breath warm as he whispered, 2 months more, and I will be free of this life. 2 months more, and we can begin again. His words were a promise, fragile yet fierce, and I let them settle into me like healing water, quenching a thirst I had carried for years. But storms do not fade simply because we wish them to. Rumors reached us of betrayal, of enemies who whispered that Vincent had gone soft, that leaving his empire was weakness. I saw the weight of it in his shoulders, the late-night calls that ended with him staring into the fire, silent and unmoving. Yet even then, he never allowed the shadows to touch me. His hand always reached for mine, his voice always softened when he spoke to Emma. And in every small gesture, he reminded me that love was not about the absence of storms, but the decision to walk through them together. The night of the sapphire ring replayed in my mind often. The way his hands trembled slightly as he held out the velvet box, the vulnerability in his eyes when he asked for patience, for trust. I wore that ring not as jewelry, but as a vow, a daily reminder that we were building something sacred, something worth every risk. And every time the sapphire caught the light, I felt the strength of his promise echo inside me, steadying me against the winds that pressed from outside. Emma, too, began to change. She no longer startled at sudden noises, no longer woke in the night crying for fear of shadows. Instead, she asked about gardens, about Italy, about places where the sun shone brighter and the air smelled of vineyards and roses. Her dreams became colorful again, filled with laughter instead of fear. And each time she asked when we would go to the castle by the sea, my heart ached with gratitude. Vincent had not only given me healing, he had given it to her too. And then came the night of departure, the night when Vincent said, "It's time." The words carried both weight and release. I packed quickly, not with despair, but with anticipation. The things I left behind no longer mattered. What mattered was Emma's soft hand in mine, Vincent's steady gaze, the road stretching into a dawn we had not yet seen. The airport lights gleamed like stars scattered across the earth. We moved quietly, shielded by men who kept watch without question. My heart pounded, not with fear, but with the wild hope that perhaps this was the moment we would step beyond the reach of shadows. Vincent's arm curled around my waist, anchoring me as the roar of engines filled the air. Emma's laughter bubbled beside us, fearless, alive, carrying the sound of a future untouched by the past. As we boarded, Vincent leaned close, his voice a whisper only for me. "Whatever comes, whatever storms still chase us, know this. You and Emma are my beginning and my end. You are my peace. You are my home." The truth in his words wrapped around me like firelight in winter, warm, steady, unbreakable. And as the plane lifted into the night, the city shrinking below, I realized that healing is not the absence of scars, but the decision to let love grow around them, softening their edges, transforming pain into strength. I held Emma close, the sapphire cool against my skin, Vincent's hand steady in mine, and I knew without doubt that whatever lay ahead, we were already whole. If this story has touched your heart, if it has brought you warmth or reminded you of the healing power of love, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters here. Let your kindness ripple outward. Like, subscribe, and stay with us for the next chapter, because love, once found, is a story that never truly ends.